Good afternoon. This is the graduate provost student lecture series. I'm Jacques Verberschot, graduate program director of physics, but I'm here because I'm also the chair of the committee that made the selection for this lecture series. We had many applications, and Jennie's was one that really stood out. That is why she's here. And Jennie Goldstein came to us from Laban College 5 years ago, a little bit more than 5 years ago, with a very prestigious graduate council fellowship. And she's now well toward her PhD. From what looking at her CV, she must be done in a year, I guess. And she's also teaching at the Whitney Museum as a teaching fellow. Today, she will speak about dancing in the museum. It's an intriguing title about really what people are doing in museums nowadays. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to her lecture. Please go ahead.
Welcome, everyone. So beginning in the 1960s and with increasing regularity, artists have incorporated dance into spaces and contexts once exclusively reserved for the plastic, fabricated arts. Posed bodies captured in still photographs, painted portraits featuring choreographers' likenesses, and objects with, on, or through which visitors move their bodies have surfaced in environments that painting and sculpture and multimedia installations call home. International exhibition organizers react to, and perhaps spur on, this move toward movement. The resulting outpouring of dance-centered curatorial programming in recent years includes Dance with Camera at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia in 2009, the Hayward Gallery's imperatively titled Move, Choreographing You, Art and Dance Since the 1960s, presented in London in 2010 and 2011, and Danser sa vie at the Centre Pompidou in 2011 and 12, or Dancing Through Life. These exhibitions, among others, locate productive overlaps between visual artists and dancers. They also offer correctives to art audiences' understanding of performance art history by bringing live dance into gallery settings. Yet, while curator Helen Molesworth acknowledges visual artists' growing interest in dance, the question of why, she writes, remains an open one. In seeking to explore Molesworth's open question, I offer a close examination of Kelly Nipper's 2009 video installation, Weather Center, a project that is emblematic of the presence of dance and of dance's particular histories in visual art. Nipper's single-channel 5-minute black and white video projection features a dancer sitting on a floor. She is the solitary occupant of an unadorned and unidentifiable interior space. Her legs are bent, the soles of her feet are pressed together, a hand positioned on each knee results in angular, crooked elbows. Clad in a loose-fitting, geometrically patterned dress, the dancer wears a mask with incisions at the eyes, nose, and mouth. The openings reveal mere slivers of her otherwise obscured face, and with her back curved and her head jutting out, the figure begins to rock from side to side, moving in parallel with the sound of a disembodied female voice that methodically and repeatedly counts to 10. The dancer raises and lowers her knees. With feet pounding against the floor beneath her, she scuttles forward, alternating raising her arms above her with fingers splayed and then firmly grasping her ankles. Each movement is specific and carefully controlled. Each movement both contains and generates energy. The artist responsible for the work, Kelly Nipper, is not the person dancing. She's not a trained or self-identifying choreographer. The movements described here take place not as part of a live event on a stage, but on the two-dimensional image plane of a video screen. The video is intended for display in a gallery setting, and its spectators are doubtless familiar with the continual rise in the numbers of artists working with projected images. However, the very same audience is just as likely not to recognize Weather Center's source material. The German choreographer Mary Wigmann's witch dance, or Hexentanz, from 1914 and 1926, a modern dance considered radical for its evocative gestures and its rejection of balletic movement. Knipper's 2009 video, completed and displayed nearly 100 years after Wigmann first performed her witch dance, instigates questions that propel this study. Why would a contemporary artist, one trained as a photographer, not only collaborate with a dancer, Taisha Paget, sitting there, and a costume designer, Leah Peel, but also look to specific instances from dance's history to create a new work of art? What's at stake when the participants, physical locations, and discursive spaces of dance and visual art converge? Weather Center is a video installation as much as it's a contemporary dance or a historical reenactment. And by refusing to privilege any of these characterizations, Knipper produces a fitting example of art making in the post-medium condition. For in keeping with what Rosalind Krauss first articulated in the late 1990s, no traditional support, like canvas or marble, defines Knipper's object. And while the era of post-medium specificity is well underway for visual artworks, an age of post-discipline specificity is perhaps less certain. Museum and performance curators, scholars, and artists alike call for increased interdisciplinarity, yet the responses can provoke terminological and territorial disturbances. The recent spate of dance in museums, whether performed, installed, or debated in symposia, is no exception. Visual art audiences may or may not embrace moving bodies in the space of, or even in place of, static sculptures and paintings. Likewise, dance audiences may or may not appreciate watching performance in gallery settings. Weather Center provides a productive point of entry into the current convergence of dancing bodies and contemporary art making on view in white cube spaces in recent years. I argue that for Knipper, dance's histories, comprised of movement and notation, personas and documents, function as malleable material. Knipper champions Paget's particular ability to enact steps that are once reperformed and improvised. And in addition, Knipper treats this specific historical performance, among other dance histories, as will soon become clear, as a kind of mutable resource. Wigmann's witch dance is here broadly available as a subject to explore or as an object to be incorporated into Knipper's body of work. Now, Knipper's contemporary practice does not subsume or obscure the specific context inscribed either in Wigmann's choreography or in the museum's particular site. Indeed, the individual elements comprising Weather Center, those derived from live performance, film documentation, written description, and still photography, inevitably bump up against each other. They bump up against the physical place of display and the discursive visual art framework, as opposed to a dance theatrical framework within which they operate. Yet amid this categorical and contextual jostling, Knipper's Weather Center ultimately makes a claim for dance's materiality and therefore its legitimacy within institutional settings that traditionally historicize, preserve, and advocate for physical things, however expansively defined. Knipper has stated that she, quote, works less with dance per se than with the science of movement, end quote, but she doesn't consider herself to be a choreographer whatsoever. Despite the continual compounding of what choreography encompasses, its definition can extend, as Harmony Bench writes, quote, beyond the field of dance, implying any kind of movement orchestration, from the transnational migration of people to the stop and go of automobiles in the street to the crafting and staging of diplomacy, end quote. Knipper's careful rhetoric evinces her discomfort with assuming a disciplinary categorization still primarily associated with theatrical dance. She seems to suggest that without years of training, cultivated vocabulary, and the embodied knowledge associated with the dance-paced typology of choreographer, she cannot assume this role whatsoever, as she says. Movement, on the other hand, is cast more generically and perhaps even more generously than the specific designation of dance, despite the consistent appearance of the latter's histories in her art making. Knipper equates movement with scientific inquiry, a data collection process that can yield results both predicted and unexpected. She ultimately eschews the terms dance and choreography, opting instead to describe herself as, quote, a visual artist who works with bodies, end quote. The bodies Knipper works with, however, are not just any bodies. In Weather Center, embodied histories are inscribed within each other and nested in the projected video loop. It's worth briefly noting here that painters, sculptors, and multimedia artists have contributed to choreographic enterprises throughout the 20th century. Pablo Picasso's designs for the Ballet Russ's Parade in 1917, Osamu Noguchi's sculptural sets for Martha Graham in the 1930s and 40s, and of course Robert Rauschenberg's costumes and decor for Merce Cunningham from the 50s and 60s are all well-known examples of innovative cross-disciplinary collaborations. Yet each of these pairings serve the ultimate goal of producing live dance events intended for theatrical presentation. In other words, ticket-wielding, seated spectators consumed these works before a proscenium stage in a darkened space. And these precedents offer rich historical context, but they cannot directly account for the contemporary pivot towards dance and visual art practice, of which Knipper's Weather Center is paradigmatic. In Knipper's project, dance history operates not just as a partner, but as viable fodder, productive stuff for art that is primarily intended for consumption within museum environments, gallery sites into which a spectator can move, watch, and then move on as she pleases, likely without having to climb over fellow audience members' legs. As dance moves into museum sites, whether through curatorial programming or as part of visual art trained practitioners' projects or otherwise, mutable histories emerge as material possibilities. But first, what are the dance histories that Knipper recapitulates? Mary Wiegmann presented Witch Dance in Munich in 1914 as part of her first formal performance as a choreographer. The extant criticism of the event hailed it as a triumph of self-sufficient dance, a sovereign art that was free to discard music, then seen as the art form from which dancers took their lead. Wiegmann danced in silence or to percussive instruments and rejected the narrative structures and character development central to ballet. She was praised for reimagining the role of costumes as intrinsic to bodily gestures, instead of as decorative elements toiling in servitude to an encompassing story. Her choreographies bowed neither to music nor to literature. Instead, she explored how her body moved in space. And there was, according to audience member and critic Rudolf von Delius, no conformity in her first dances, no masquerade, no theatrics. Historians championed Wiegmann's dances from the 19-teens and 20s, which dance included, for their modernist self-reflexivity. They embodied what came to be known as absolute dance. So Wiegmann's avant-garde refusals, her acts of saying or dancing, no to conformity, no to masquerade, no to theatrics, as articulated by von Delius, were echoed in late modern art history and postmodern dance. In 1965, dancer Yvonne Rainer penned what is described as her no manifesto, which reads in part, quote, no to spectacle, no to virtuosity, no to transformations and magic and make-believe, no to seduction of the spectator by the wiles of the performer, no to eccentricity, no to moving and being moved, end quote. As Marianne Goldberg has argued, by the late 1950s, dancers who trained in the highly expressive and emotive techniques espoused by choreographers such as Wiegmann, but also by Americans Martha Graham and Doris Humphrey, quote, found in their classes and training a system of representation rather than a form that could be experienced as spontaneous, end quote. With her 1965 text and the dances that inspired it and followed in its wake, Rainer broke from the previously cutting-edge, but by then fully canonized modes of modern dance. Rainer's early 1960s performances presented the body as a vehicle for task-like, everyday movement. In We Shall Run from 1963, a group of street-clothed and sneaker-clad participants jogged as a herd in one direction, then in another, and then in another. In Trio A, her most famous and also most theorized dance, Rainer combined a series of steps that never repeat, never speed up or slow down. Trio A denies the spectator the chance to read her choreography as phrasings that grow, reach a pinnacle, and conclude. With her eyes constantly averted, we never get the chance to meet Rayner's gaze, to create a link from her body to ours. Despite the overt stylistic differences between Rayner's and Wigmann's performances, Rayner's refusals circle back to meet her predecessors. For Rayner also refused narrativity. She too turned away from the rhythmic guidance of orchestral music. Rayner's dances and many others were incubated within the space and context of the Judson Dance Theater, a loose collective of choreographers who ushered in the era of postmodern dance through the cooperative efforts of dancers and artists and musicians. Gathering in the Judson Memorial Church's Greenwich Village basement starting in 1962, the participants championed pedestrian actions, the use of everyday items, and accepted non-dancers onto the stage, a space not always clearly demarcated from that occupied by the audience. This historically charged site is particularly crucial to my examination of Knipper's project. For Weather Center is only one part of a larger, ongoing multimedia work called Floyd on the Floor, a live segment of which the artist staged in the Judson Memorial Church Gymnasium in 2007. So this name, Floyd on the Floor, encompasses both this overarching, ongoing work and the very live event that you're looking at stills from. Knipper has evocatively claimed that the basement location selected for the live performance serves as, quote, the burial chamber of the most experimental period in recent art history, end quote. Now, this statement is both loaded and telling. Beginning with her claim's end, she aligns the Judson Dance Theater with the field of art history rather than with the field of dance history or dance studies, thus signaling her point of entry into the interdisciplinary work staged under the Judson Dance rubric. Carrie Lambert-Beattie's 2008 text on Rayner has arguably done more to further the status of Judson dance among visual artists and art historians than any other. Lambert-Beattie evinces how Judson performances entered the art history of this period by way of the group's earliest scholar advocate, a woman named Sally Baines. Baines is a dance historian, but as Lambert-Beattie points out, her positioning of the Judson Dance Theater as committed to democratic and collective processes in her 1993 book, Democracy's Body, Judson Dance Theater, 1962 to 1964, was picked up on just a few years later in art historian Thomas Crowe's 1966 publication, The Rise of the 60s. So in Lambert-Beattie's paraphrasing of Crowe's argument, she lists the privileged qualities of 1960s art making. These include repetition and seriality, resistance to emotional display, and non-hierarchical composition. These elements, Crowe posits, quote, first came together as ethical imperatives in the conduct of the Judson Circle, end quote. In other words, Crowe suggests that Judson dance was the crucial innovator that underscored the post-minimal process-based art of the mid and late 1960s. So with this art historical framework in mind, we can return to Knipper's morbid description of the Judson Church Gymnasium as a burial chamber. One could simply interpret this designation as a kind of playful riff on the gym's subterranean locale. Yet it also reflects a perceived discursive finality, whether experienced by the artist or one she's sort of projecting out onto others, as if the dances and concepts nurtured in this space have been sealed shut. As Knipper's project makes clear, these histories, constituting art, dance, or otherwise, are anything but entombed. They're fungible, alive, and ongoing. Situated in the specific place of this Judson Gymnasium, amid increasingly fluid art and dance historical demarcations, Knipper presented this first live work, Floyd on the Floor. And her performance practice, she explains, expands from her background in photography and film and video, technologies that, quote, collapse vast fields and passage of time into the here and now, end quote. Knipper began the ongoing Floyd project in 2005 and derived its title from her abiding interest in weather systems, specifically Hurricane Floyd, a Category 4 storm that generated in the Atlantic Ocean in 1999 and battered the mid-Atlantic coast. This storm operates as a metaphor for history in Knipper's work. Artifacts and documents, events and ideas, they all swirl around the hurricane's eye. In the eponymous 2007 performance, the artist combined her fascination with the unpredictability of meteorological patterns with the notational system Laban notation, a graphical process developed to record experimental dance that effectively wards off the threat of its persistent ephemerality. Invented in the late 1920s by Wigmann's teacher, the dancer Rudolf von Laban, Laban notation maps a dancer's body parts, specific steps, energies, and trajectories onto staffs that can later be read just like musical notes and then re-executed. In Knipper's dance, four duos traverse a space as wrist-clasped pairs or perform alone as they wind parachutes around their ankles. Knipper covered their stage, the Judson Church Gymnasium floor, with large diagrams that graphically chart the movement from one of her early video works utilizing Laban's notational devices. Floyd on the Floor correlates radar technologies and Laban notation. Both systems attempt to render observable subjects that resist these impulses. Weather is notoriously unpredictable, yet we rely on Doppler devices and others to track and analyze precipitation. Live dancing bodies cannot be fixed before our eyes, but Laban notation can hold choreographic elements in place just long enough for us to analyze steps and propulsion and then, ideally, embody them anew. And just as the weather graphics on the evening news make perfect sense to the reporter but seem sort of obscure to the viewer, Laban notation functions as a language discernible only to the trained reader. This is like a very complicated example of this. So down in the Judson Church basement, the elements of Knipper's storm seem to swell. She utilizes a crucial innovation of modern European dance history, Laban notation, in the very place that postmodern American dance found its footing. While those associated with Judson dance endeavor to slough off the bodily and historical weight of modernist expressivity, decades before them, modern dancers like Wigmann and Laban said no to the narrative-dependent theatrics of 19th century ballet. And while many art and dance historical accounts have positioned postmodern dance in both chronological and ideological opposition to its modern predecessor, Knipper's project affirms Susan Manning's reclaiming of so-called postmodern Judson dance as, quote, one of the last outposts of modernism, end quote. Manning argues that Judson dance met modernism's two key stipulations by focusing on the reflexive rationalization of movement on the one hand and upholding the distinction between modern dance and ballet on the other. In Knipper's work, the legacies of 1920s European dance and 1960s New York innovation seem purposefully undifferentiated, perhaps even interchangeable. No single element is more crucial, no referent more celebrated than any other. Both Weather Center and the live segment of Floyd on the Floor recapitulate 20th century dance. Knipper transliterates choreography. Dance history and its temporalities in her hands are pliable. Yet, as we well know, Knipper does not manipulate her own body. She is not the dancer featured in Weather Center, nor does she appear moving among the dancers in the live portion of Floyd on the Floor. Instead, she promotes and relies upon a cross-disciplinary effort. Knipper has worked with professional dancers since 1998, quote, as a way to explore the mechanics of moving in still images in relation to bodily existence, the spatial environment, and time, end quote. The dancers' trained agility is of paramount importance. Their precision, discipline, and their bodily existence, as Knipper says, are powerful materials around and through which Knipper can explore these broad themes like temporality and spatiality. She needs expertise she does not personally have in order to achieve her artistic goals. Outsourcing as a contemporary method in performance art has recently received a great deal of scholarly attention. Following Claire Bishop's assessment of what she terms the social turn in performance art, Knipper seems to outsource or delegate aspects of Weather Center to experts in order to seek authenticity. Bishop rightly posits that the tendency among contemporary performance artists to assign the physical enactment of their artworks or events to others, often professionals, demonstrates a significant shift away from the body-based practices of the 1960s and 70s. Then the artist's body was seen as entirely free of charge, available any time, and was the perfect material basis for projects that stressed physical and psychological endurance. But in the subsequent decades, as the art market has effectively monetized live and recorded performance art, artists have in turn been able to increase the scope and attendant costs of their works by bringing skilled collaborators into their process. So Bishop primarily examines socially collaborative, politically oriented works as examples of what she calls delegated performance. The most successful of these often participatory artworks, she argues, are those in which artists seek out the specialized knowledge or abilities of a particular group that's bound by geography or ethnicity, class, or occupation. The resulting artworks, if effectively executed, implicate, provoke, or disrupt the privileged art world audience. So just one pertinent example is a work by Tanya Bruguera, a performance called Tatlin's Whisper 5 from 2008, for which the artist hired mounted policemen to demonstrate crowd control methods to viewer participants assembled in gallery spaces. These trained officials, Bruguera's project suggests, are much more capable of instilling feelings of fear or powerlessness in the corralled audience than a group of actors would, or the artist herself if she were mounted on one of these horses. Nipper, for her part, looks to Paget's particular expertise, her movement sensibilities and abilities. Dancers, quote, know their bodies more than anyone, Nipper avers. Paget's dancing body conjures Wiegmann's witch. Indeed, Nipper's own attempt would certainly appear inexpert, perhaps even farcical. Yet when presented with this historical repositioning, Weather Center's viewers do not experience this shock or disruption that Bishop identifies as crucial for successful delegated performance. Wiegmann's choreography, reinstated as Nipper's contemporary video projection via Paget's dancing body, in fact shares an affinity with Grant Kester's advocacy for recent collaborative projects that are, quote, concerned with the generation of insight through durational interaction rather than rupture, end quote. So instead of the intense burst of frustration or panic or sympathy for corralled political protesters that Bruguera's audiences potentially feel, Kester reserves the term durational interaction for artistic endeavors predicated upon sustained and continuous relationships, plural, excuse me. As an adjective used to describe performance art, durational is typically associated with projects that extend for many hours or even for weeks or months and that push upon our limits of mental and physical stamina. Kester, however, champions artists working on collective ideas that can affect social change in lived environments as opposed to sites of display like museums. So artists operating in this mode, such as a group called Dialogue, a collective working in the Bastar region of central India, working to design ergonomic and efficient water pumps, so artistic and also productive. These groups often assume grassroots methods familiar to activists and urban planners, methods that require organization, communication, and a sense of perseverance. So neither of these examples fit Nipper quite right. She operates near and between these contemporary models of delegation and duration. She delegates, to be sure, but she also closely confers with dancers across individual and interrelated projects and over sustained time periods. Weather Center suggests a form of durational interaction committed to intersightedness. Wiegmann's 1926 Witch Dance, originally choreographed for theatrical presentation, is here presented, or rather projected, through Nipper's 2009 museum installation. Nipper's melding of these traditionally distinct sites can provoke disciplinary anxiety. On the one hand, Nipper risks misrepresenting Wiegmann's work in the process of reperforming it, not on the stage, but on the screen. And on the other hand, she reminds visual art audiences of museums' unsavory role in decontextualizing and essentializing non-Western art throughout the 20th century. Wiegmann explained that she derived her movements from, I'm quoting Wiegmann, spiritual characters that evoked pagan religiosities once associated with polytheism and pre-Christian Europe, end quote. Nipper, in turn, channels these gestural incantations and recapitulates centuries past Western European references in close collaboration with a practicing African-American dancer. Paget, like Wiegmann before her, moves while wearing a mask. And this feature-obscuring device simultaneously references pre-Christian Europe, Wigmann's taking up of African-inspired forms as a means to deflect the male gaze, and serves as a pointed reminder of the complicated legacies of African masks within 20th century Western painting and sculpture. So for museum spectators unfamiliar with Wigmann and her dances, but steeped in visual art and exhibition history, Paget's masked African-American body immediately signals art's troubled past with so-called primitivism. Not only did early 20th century Cubist and Expressionist painters and sculptors appropriate African art forms while discarding their religious and other use values, Wigmann, it would seem, is implicated in this very kind of practice. So too have museum curators displayed non-Western objects side by side with the European works they formally influenced. Most infamously in the Museum of Modern Art's 1984 exhibition, Primitivism in the 20th Century, Affinity of the Tribal and the Modern. And as Hal Foster wrote in the immediate aftermath of MoMA's controversial exhibit, quote, "The primitive tribal is set adrift from specific reference and coordinates, which thus allows it to be defined in wholly Western terms. And one begins to see that one of the preconditions of the primitivism show is the mummification of the tribal and the museumification of its objects," end quote. Museums as institutions have researched, preserved, and masked cultural artifacts. Legacies of appropriation are today's cautionary tales. Indeed, the lingering results of the museumification of non-Western tribal artworks perhaps stir concern among dance practitioners and dance audiences that dance, too, might become just another formal typology subsumed within the gallery-driven commercial art world. And while it's certainly the case that Nipper, a non-dancer, utilizes choreography, moving bodies, and dance notation devices, all elements derived from disciplines outside her own, her projects ultimately reveal and even reconfigure art history's troubled legacies through what is, for many museum goers, an unexpected medium. Dance and its histories, in other words, make this new visual art possible. So Nipper is certainly participating in this outsourcing of expertise that Bishop describes, but gauging the authenticity that this method promotes becomes difficult to calibrate. Paget's performance of Wigmann's choreography, however carefully reenacted, is actually quite different. Where Wigmann's body is explosive, her splayed fingers evoking gestural incantations, Paget is cool and distanced. Her body offers the kinesthetic facts, plainly stated. Authenticity is a loaded term, to be sure, and an explicit recreation of Wigmann's dance is neither objectively possible nor Nipper's goal. And yet, if Nipper delegated the step's execution in order to achieve a so-called authentic performance of the witch dance, one that could be categorized as a strict historical reenactment, then the professional dancer tasked with the job would potentially seek to embody the emotive quality of Wigmann's original. Absent Wigmann-esque expressivity, something more than just a will to recreate historical dance must be afoot. And there are several possible ways to account for the dancing differences in Wigmann's witch dance and Nipper's Weather Center. First, a most blatant reading. Paget is not the choreographer of this dance. She is not feeling the dance internally, as did her predecessor. Paget, and Nipper too, function here in the role of imitator, however deferential. But a more productive analysis hinges on dance's history. For Nipper, the durational interactions, or intersightedness, suggest, as we've seen in both the live segment of Floyd on the Floor and in Weather Center, a circling back over and across dance and art historical divides. But she can only do so with the help of images and artifacts, both still and moving. Extant photographs of Wigmann's 1914 Witch Dance 1, for example, capture her in this billowing cape-like costume in a sense of suspended motion, feet elevated off the floor and arms spread wide overhead. Wigmann doesn't pose for posterity. Instead, the fixed moment conveys active propulsion. Nipper's video, however, directly refers to the German choreographer's 1926 documented reconstruction of Witch Dance, also sometimes called Witch Dance 2. And in the surviving film, Wigman appears adorned in a long brocaded dress with a high neck and wide openings for each arm. Her body is nearly subsumed, and a mask, as we know, obscures much of her face. Seated on the floor of what is surely a stage, Wigman moves in time with jarring percussive accompaniment. When she's not moving, the drums and cymbals stop. The footage may have been intended to serve as publicity for Wigman's first American tour in 1930, and the filmic style supports this theory. Wigman is positioned straight on, and the camera is held steady until the dancer propels her body forward, picking up speed with each straightening of her leg at the knee and subsequent smack of her floor-pounding foot. At this point, the camera retreats in an attempt to maintain distance between its apparatus and the gesturing body. It is only at this moment, as the camera wobbles slightly and angles down to maintain the centrally framed dancer, that the viewer is forced to attend to the fact that there's someone else, the camera operator, moving out of sight. In Weather Center, Wigman's absolute historical modern choreography is filtered through the cerebral, detached dancing modes of the 1960s. Both early 20th century European breaks with balletic tradition and Judson's post-war legacies are so much modifiable material utilized to create a projected video installation, one made by a photographer explicitly for presentation within the art museum gallery. In Knipper's hands, dance histories and contemporary art-making practices result in a work that is not actually a dance. But Weather Center, the video, is not a dance either. In other words, Weather Center is a dance insofar as it clearly calls on and enacts a series of conventions within a discipline that we call dance. Yet it does not intend to continue or disrupt or otherwise function within that tradition in such a way that it opens itself up to criticism in the terms of that tradition. It is dancing that is otherwise than dance. The otherwise is rooted in the multiple movements of Knipper and her camera, as an examination of Knipper's camera work makes clear. A single camera is trained on a dancer. Its focus alternates between steady shots of the subject and horizontal pans. When the dancer, Paget, is centered within the frame, the resulting footage is reminiscent of documentation. Recall the archival film of Wigman's 26 version that we just saw. Then, unexpectedly, the camera starts to move to the dancer's left, as if some other action is about to take place beyond our view. A sudden jerk shifts our full attention and the camera's focus back to the recentered dancer. There is no visible bodily action beyond the frame. The camera is effectively active here. The dancer and the recording device do not move in controlled synchrony. Their identities are related, yet they remain separate entities. Knipper used a tripod-mounted camera and a second dolly-mounted camera to capture footage for Weather Center. Standing either behind the tripod or off to the side, especially when she was using a dolly that ran along tracks laid on the floor in a half circle, Knipper shot take after take after take. And this repetitive method is crucial to her working process, and like these dance histories that she manipulates and reforms, it aligns with her durational rather than a kind of rupturing practice. While filming Paget moving, Knipper considered Wigman's tendency to send everything in one direction while performing her witch dance. Quote, the eyes follow the direction of the body or a limb or the thrust of the weight in the movement, Knipper explains, and in response, the camera either moved in the same direction or lagged in speed, or lagged in speed and moving in that same direction, or moved counter to that direction. The artist's reimagining of witch dance at once derives from and results in so much filmed footage to be utilized, altered, and edited into a new projected product. Paget moves, Wigman's histories move, but so too does Knipper move behind the camera out of our sight. And Knipper typically interweaves research with structured improvisations, and this method proved particularly necessary for the section of Weather Center in which Paget stands, executes a series of gestures, and then returns to the floor. And since the film excerpt of Witch Dance 2 ends before Wigman's propulsive energy sends her into an erect position, scholars and artists alike rely upon still photographs and other contemporaneously written reviews in order to describe or perform this dynamic choreography. David Velasco has suggested that this segment of Weather Center, quote, serves to anchor the score within a chain of historical significations, end quote. And it's certainly the case that Nipper's archival and improvisatory working modes enable her to explore, as she claims, the sustainability of recorded and repeated information as it changes from one form to another. But the results are more open than anchored. In the portion of Weather Center that operates without a documentary moving image counterpart, Nipper is offering us a historical corrective as much as she's offering a new dance. Nipper's Weather Center is a convergence of dance, art, and museological practices. These discourses all share interconnected histories, and Nipper, among other contemporary visual art practitioners, have taken notice. And as artists look to dance, its live movement, its stilled images, its legacies, and critical receptions for projects intended for non-theatrical consumption, we must seek to determine what movement offers them. Movement functions as a substrate for dance, whether choreographed or improvised, but what role might movement have to play in the conception, construction, or utilization of visual art objects? Looking back to works made before the 21st century can help, historical hindsight. Art historians and dance studies scholars have identified the 1960s and early 70s as a crucial time for cross-disciplinary cooperation between artists and dancers working in the United States. And while art historians draw parallels between the use of repetition in minimalist sculpture and experimental dance, dance scholars tend to celebrate the emergence of democratic choreographic modes that encouraged untrained performers, like visual artists, to participate in movement making. However, it tends to be the case that scholars in both fields have neglected to examine how danced movements can be sculptural, or how built things operate not just as sculptures, but as intrinsic elements of a choreographic exploration. And a substantive historical exploration of how dance and dancing bodies function in non-theatrical sites underscores the importance of 1960s and 70s interdisciplinarity and the era's influence on contemporary visual artists like Nipper. In my larger dissertation project, I uncover the historical basis for the current convergence of dancing bodies and contemporary art. In it, I contend that a choreographic impulse to mark, to notate, to execute, and re-execute is intrinsic to late modern artists' use of space and to the objects with which they move. By revealing the interactions between constructed objects and choreography, the overlooked ways in which visual artists use their dancing bodies, and the physical screen as a connective site for moving bodies and projected moving images, my research furthers ongoing debates about the influence of interdisciplinarity on the American visual arts of the 60s and 70s. But ultimately, I extend this discussion beyond collaborative exploration and determine what is at stake when a dance becomes a thing and things become dances. As we have seen today, notational theories, photographs, filmed footage, and published reviews form the basis of Nipper's research-based projects. Her status as an archive-driven artist no doubt derives from her years of experience working as a professional archivist for the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, and in a similar capacity for Alan Kaprow, an artist who developed the so-called happenings, or non-repeatable live events in the late 1950s. And Kaprow's influence looms large. In describing her art-making process to interviewers, Nipper has repeatedly recalled Kaprow's commitment to changing his mind, his firm belief that doing so is always permissible. This stance has allowed her to work within and around the open-ended and ongoing Floyd on the Floor project, of which Weather Center is one part. More crucially, however, it fosters thinking about and utilizing dance across various mediations, whether live or stilled, annotated or textually described, repeated or lost. Nipper's mutable process involves what she terms stretching images in time. The environment is a shifting shape. And in this way, Nipper's body of work signals a productive convergence rather than just collaboration between dance and art. Put differently, these creative disciplines are not working in parallel. Instead, as Weather Center proves, they move toward, around, and into each other. Thank you.